Hi everyone, it's Paul Tilley and welcome to HN1100. Today we're discussing contract negotiations. As you recall, we've discussed the fact that the union has been put in place. So a couple things we need to assume right here. We're into a position where we have a brand new union in the workplace and the two sides have to get together to be able to hammer out a collective agreement. So last week, we looked at Chapter 7, and Chapter 7 dealt with defining the basic issues surrounding collective bargaining before we ever started. Now, if you recall, one of the things that we discussed there was the fact that negotiations need to get off to a good start. And this is done if you look at the basic notes here, you'll see that we have a certified union in place. That certified union is the collective bargaining agent for that group of workers. That certified union needs to consider what its workers want. And that's probably the very first step before negotiations ever begin. What is it our workers want? How do they find that out? Well, they meet with the workers. So workers need to get together and say, okay, look, I want a pay increase. I want extra benefits. I want more vacation time. So we got a whole list of things that workers would like. This creates an itemized list. Then they need to say, okay, what are our priorities? What are the key things? And at what levels do these priorities have to come to? So say, for example, let's just pick a couple of major issues. Wages. Workers wanted a pay increase. So let's say that the union sits down and says, okay, how much of a wage increase do we want? Well, we want at least 6% over the term of the contract. Okay. Then it needs to be asked, what are you willing to accept? Okay, if we want 6, are we willing to accept nothing less than 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1? And in order to be able to define what we accept, we need to say, okay, are we prepared to go on strike for that? Do we believe in it strongly enough that we're prepared to go on strike? When negotiations occur, there's a toing and froing. So let's say, for example, the union said, well, we want 10%, but we'll accept 6. Well, in the initial stages of negotiations, the union are going to go to management and say, we want a 10% raise. Management, odds are, is going to come back and say, no, we're not prepared to do that. We'll give you a 2% raise. So what we're doing is the union will be here, the management will be here, the gap between them through negotiations will narrow. Now there comes a point where both will say, okay, this is my range and this is my range. And you'll get this overlap, like my two thumbs, you'll get an overlap period. That is the agreement area. That is an area in which agreement can be reached. So if both sides say, well, we certainly accept 6%. Management are prepared to pay 6% and union is willing to accept 6%. That's the basis on how union agreements are made. So Chapter 7 really focused on that initial stage where we say, okay, let's get together as a union, find out what workers want. Management also get together independently and say, what are we prepared to give? What do we want? So management are going to discuss amongst themselves, how much each of these potential offers in terms of wages will cost the company. How much can the company afford? What can the company do? What can the company not do? What is the company prepared to do in order to stake its position? In other words, is it willing to accept a strike in order to stake its position on whatever they choose? So the two sides, each side independently gets together. When we move to Chapter 8, Chapter 8 is really focused on, okay, now the two sides have got initial setups. So management has said, we're prepared to do this. And the union has said, we're prepared to do that. They come together. This initial meeting is what is talked about in Chapter 8. The initial meeting is called for normally by the union. So the union writes the management and says, we want to get together to start negotiations. So the union comes with all of its requests in hand that it pulled from the original meetings that it had with its brethren. At this initial meeting, the initial meeting is very important because people get together, get to meet one another and socialize a little bit, just get a sense of who they're dealing with in terms of the negotiations. And then the union presents to the management, here's what our workers want. The management can also present to the union, here's what we're prepared to give. But that may or may not happen. Most importantly, the union gets that information to the management, and the management are going to look at it and say, wow, that's a lot to ask. So normally there's no real negotiation that happens in that first meeting. It's just get to know you, get what you want, and then leave. So after they leave, management gets together as a group in and of itself and looks at this list of requests by the union and says, yeah, this is something we can deal with or something that we can't deal with. Say for example, the union wanted a 10% wage increase, and the most management could possibly afford to give, they feel, is 6. Well, there's a gap between what the union wants and what the management will be prepared to offer. So what management will do is effectively create a counter proposal. So management will look down through this list of asks and say, okay, we could go a little bit on this one, a little bit on that one. No, we can't do that. So management will accept and reject and potentially create a counteroffer. Now, management knows when it makes that counteroffer that it's not going to give away the farm, meaning that if management has, in its original meetings with itself, says we could go up as high as 6%, odds are they're not going to offer 6% increase right away. They might go for 3%. They might go for 2%. So when the management comes back to the union, when they have a second meeting, management will come back with a counteroffer and say, here's what we're prepared to give. So what we're seeing is with that counteroffer is the original claims of both management and the original claims of union start to work towards one another, meaning they get closer and closer and closer. So the union wanted 10%, management is offering 3%. That's a little bit closer. That doesn't mean, though, the union is going to accept it. So what we're going to see is a bunch of toing and froing. So this process of saying, okay, we're going to review our offer, we'll come back with a counteroffer, could go on multiple times. And as long as movement is taking place, as long as we're edging closer, the meetings will be fruitful. There does come a point, though, where the meetings say, okay, we can't go any further. This is about as far as we can go right now. And you have a couple options. First of all, we can take a break in the negotiations. That gives the time for each side to kind of review where it is, where it wants to go, how it wants to do it, how committed it is to a given. And that just allows for people to reconsider their positions. That could take a period of weeks, could be months. The other alternative is for the union to go off to the Department of Labor, the Labor Relations Board, which is an independent body, and say, could we get some help? So this is where you bring in what's called a conciliator. And a conciliator is a person who is employed by the Labor Relations Board. So it's a quasi-government employee. Comes in and sits down with the two sides and tries to help them reach an agreement. And that often works very well. Otherwise, there will be a break sometime along or a strike. So let's take the option where we don't bring in a conciliator, but both sides aren't really moving. After this time period has gone by, people are going to start reevaluating positions, and eventually someone's going to say, we really should offer something a little more to the union, or the union will say, well, we're willing to give more to the management. This could result in more negotiations, and eventually this gap will narrow and narrow and narrow. How do you bring it to a close, though? Well, like it or not, odds are this closing process normally happens towards the end of the contract or when people are almost prepared to go on strike. So you got to get narrower and narrower. And there are points that people say, I'm not going to cross that line. I'm not going to give any more than 6% raise in the case of the management, or I'm not going to accept anything less than 8% raise in the case of the union. They're going to look at it and they're going to evaluate the positions and say, are we prepared to go on strike for this? Strikes are expensive. You lose money. From a company's point of view, they're expensive. So the threat of a strike certainly causes this motion towards an agreement. Eventually, 95% of cases reach an agreement. However, 5% of cases, it doesn't work out. A conciliator comes in to help. Nothing helps. And odds are the group will end up going on strike. But you know what? all strikes come to an end. So a strike is just another process, another step in the negotiating process, because eventually, strike or no strike, the two sides will come to an agreement. Because we got to think about it. The union-labor relationship is an ongoing relationship. It's like a marriage. The management are not going to get rid of the union, and the unless the business is closed, the union is not going to get rid of the management. So they have to work it out eventually. It's just the time it takes to do that. So it's very important to be able to look at it and say, okay, let's look at both sides. As they keep narrowing, it takes time to reach, to get to that agreement point where both sides say, okay, I'm prepared to, and we're prepared to do the same. It will get there eventually. Let's assume now they've reached an agreement. So, okay, we've reached to that stage. What do we have to do? Well, negotiations have ended. Both sides have reached an agreement, but those agreements need to be what's called ratified, meaning that the negotiating team needs to take it to the union and say, all of the unionized workers say, are you agreeable with this? So there's usually a vote, and if the vote can go one of two ways. It can accept the agreement, which means that the agreement gets passed, or it can turn down the agreement, in which case the process all starts over again. Most times, the negotiating committee has a good understanding of what workers are prepared to, because these initial meetings at the very beginning, when they met with the union brethren, kind of said, here's what we're willing. Also, the fact that a strike is looming certainly means that people are more willing to move. So essentially, those are the key things in Chapter 8 in terms of the negotiations. The other section of Chapter 8 talks about, okay, internally within the negotiations, let's look at some of the issues regarding negotiations. One of the key things that you need to be aware of is this issue of the types of bargaining that happen within negotiations. 3 types of bargaining are described in here. The first type is intra-organizational bargaining, I-N-T-R-A, intra, meaning internal. Intra-bargaining occurs at the very front end when the union group sits down with the union and the workers and try to negotiate, what is it you guys want? What are you prepared to give? And what should we offer management? So some people in the union are going to say, I want wages. Some people are going to say, well, I want seniors benefits. Some people are going to say, I want more vacation. This negotiation goes on to be able to pick what are the key items that we're going to go negotiate. So intra-organizational bargaining is bargaining within the organization itself. Within management, we'll have intra-organizational bargaining. And within the union, we'll have intra-organizational bargaining. That's within their own little group. They need to bargain amongst themselves to find out what are we prepared and what do we want in the negotiations. Another type of bargaining that is talked about, the other 2 types of bargaining that are talked about, are happening within the negotiations themselves. The first type of bargaining that's discussed is something called integrative bargaining. Integrative bargaining is a more modern concept. Integrative bargaining means both parties work towards a common agreement in which both benefit. So it's a feel-good type bargaining. I will give you something, you give me something, and we'll both benefit because of it. That means that all sides benefit. And over the last 50 years, that's been popular. Because what it does is create, you assume that the union labor management relationship goes on indefinitely, and both sides working together to fill both needs and both requirements. It's certainly a good thing. It's seen as a good thing. So people work together as opposed to fighting one another. Let's work together to achieve more. The other type of bargaining that is old type bargaining is called distributive type bargaining. Distributive means that I win and you lose. It's a zero-sum thing. We only have so much money. You're going to get more of it, or I'm going to get more of it. And if I win, you lose. This type of bargaining happens really when things get tough. And that is, we only have so much to give, and we're going to fight for the 2 sides. And I use the word fight purposely because when we think of distributive bargaining, it is really a fight. I want more from you, so it's a tug of war. That's not very good for this long-term relationship because I win, you lose. You lose, I win. It leads to bad feelings. So most modern bargaining has stayed away from this type of I win, you lose type mentality. Maybe politicians could learn something from that. The final thing that you need to look at in Chapter 8 is this issue of what's going on with regards to some of the theories. And when we think about the theories of bargaining, we think about something called attitudinal structuring. And attitudinal structuring looks at how do we create proper attitude within the organizations, be it the union or the management, in order to help best move negotiations forward. So what we do is we create a rationale for all positions that are taken. So, for example, on management, I don't want to pay you any more salary. Well, here's my rationale for it. I can't afford it. The economy's really bad. These sorts of things. Legitimate reasons, as opposed I just don't want to give it to you. So attitude structuring is very common, and what it does is it makes negotiations more successful by prefacing any asks or wants on some basis of fact, and that allows us to be better in terms of success. And we also think about in here some of the issues with regards to union management negotiations and the role of power in that. How much power do you have? Let's say, for example, that you're provincial government and you're in the process of negotiating with your snowplow operators. Let's think about it. How much power do snowplow operators have in the middle of summer? Very little. How much power do snowplow operators have in the middle of winter? A lot. So different times, different places, the inventory, the weather conditions, all those can affect how much power a given group will have, how much money there is, how well the economy is doing. So if we look at the Chapter 8, you should be aware of those sorts of things in there. Take a look at it. Again, it's very good reading. This book is a great book and straight to read. So you have to have a good understanding of how this negotiation process works and what are some of the bases for that negotiation. Well, thanks for watching today.